Well, the Trump administration has launched an all-out assault on public education in America. They have destroyed the Department of Education in real time. And they're going after hardworking American students, including college students, who are just simply trying to experience the American dream. An American dream that is increasingly out of reach for far too many hardworking American taxpayers. And the American people know it. And the American people also know that Donald Trump's administration and Republican policies have been a complete and total disaster. That's why this guy is at like 36% in approval. They're losing elections all across the country, literally in deep red parts of the country, including, most recently, in Miami and in Georgia, where the Republicans lost a special election for a state house seat that Donald Trump had just won.
You just watched Hakeem Jeffries speak truth to power, and you felt it in your bones, didn't you? Because what we're witnessing right here is nothing less than the systematic dismantling of opportunity itself, wrapped in the grotesque pageantry of plutocratic cruelty, masquerading as fiscal responsibility. And let me tell you what Jeffries understands, that every single person watching this needs to sear into their consciousness right now, because this moment crystallizes everything wrong with Republican governance, in an era where the word democracy has become a euphemism for class warfare executed by men in poorly fitted suits who worship at the altar of inherited wealth. Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education, and the administration has handed off some of its biggest grant programs to other federal agencies, pornticuted Europlave, and here's what makes your blood boil when you really think about the philosophical implications of such barbarism, because most notable is an agreement that will put the Department of Labor over some of the largest federal funding streams for K-12 schools, including Title I money for schools serving low-income communities, which means they're literally taking resources designed to give poor children a fighting chance and burying them in bureaucratic obscurity, where accountability goes to die. The sheer audacity of this administration's moral depravity becomes even clearer when you understand what just happened literally days ago, because the Department of Education has moved to terminate one of former President Joe Biden's most popular student loan forgiveness plans through a proposed joint settlement with Missouri, ending the Saving on a Valuable Education or SAVE plan, which is home to over 7 million student loan borrowers. And wait, there's more that'll make you want to march straight to Washington, because the 7+ million borrowers enrolled in SAVE will face higher monthly loan payments and may lose out on months of progress toward loan forgiveness, which, if you're keeping track, means millions of young Americans who were promised relief, who were told that education was their ticket to economic mobility, are now being kicked while they're down by an administration that gave billionaires tax cuts without blinking an eye. Think about the moral calculus here for just one moment, because we're talking about an administration that claims the SAVE plan would have cost U.S. taxpayers more than $342 billion over 10 years, while conveniently forgetting that Trump's 2017 tax cuts for the wealthy cost roughly $2 trillion, and nobody in the Republican Party clutched their pearls over fiscal responsibility. Then did they? And here's where the ideological bankruptcy becomes so transparent, it's almost laughable, except people's lives are being destroyed, so there's nothing funny about it, because Undersecretary Nicholas Kent said the Biden administration sought to unlawfully shift student loan debt onto American taxpayers, many of whom either never took out a loan to finance their post-secondary education or never even went to college themselves simply for a political win, which is such a disingenuous framing of social investment that it would make Ayn Rand herself blush, because by this logic we shouldn't fund public schools unless everyone has children, we shouldn't fund roads unless everyone drives, we shouldn't fund fire departments unless everyone's house is currently burning. The entire concept of a social contract dissolves into the acid bath of libertarian nihilism. The SAVE plan is an income-driven repayment plan first introduced in 2023 that helped borrowers struggling to keep up with high-interest loans, aiming to reduce monthly payments based on income and family size, prevent interest from ballooning, and accelerate loan forgiveness for some low-income borrowers, which means this was precisely the kind of program that recognizes education as a public good, as an investment in human capital, as a mechanism for reducing inequality, rather than entrenching it. But Trump's Education Secretary Linda McMahon, who by the way made her fortune running professional wrestling entertainment, now gets to body slam the dreams of an entire generation. Let's talk about the electoral repudiation that Jeffries mentions, because this is where the data becomes absolutely delicious for anyone who believes in accountability, because President Donald Trump's job approval rating has fallen 5 percentage points to 36%, the lowest of his second term, while disapproval has risen to 60%, and before you dismiss this as just one poll, Consider that only 31% of U.S. adults now approve of how Trump is handling the economy, down from 40% in March, marking the lowest economic approval he's registered in an AP/NORC poll in his first or second term, which is absolutely stunning when you remember that Trump won re-election largely on economic messaging, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. The special elections tell an even more devastating story for Republicans, because in 60 state legislative and congressional special elections, this year Democrats have improved from their 2024 margins by an average of 13%. And in Tennessee, super PACs from both parties poured more than $6.5 million into making this a high-turnout, high-profile contest, where Democrats still ended up improving their margins by 13%. Meaning even when Republicans throw everything they have at defending deep red territory, they're hemorrhaging support because voters are waking up to the reality that Republican policies don't put food on the table or reduce the crushing anxiety of debt. And speaking of special elections, let me paint you the fuller picture, because virtually every electoral signal in special elections and in key contests in New Jersey, Virginia, and California pointed to a sharp shift of opinion away from President Trump and his party, a deterioration of the coalition that elected him in 2024, a fiercely mobilized Democratic base, and the enduring power of the cost of living in fueling discontent, while swings toward Democrats of 16 and 23 points in two Florida specials in April and in September, of 16 points in an open Virginia seat and 17 points in an Arizona seat, demonstrate that this isn't some regional aberration, but a wholesale rejection of Republican governance. Republicans failed to flip any legislative seats in 2025, losing ground even in New Jersey where they had high hopes, and Democrats secured strong gains reminiscent of 2017, winning multiple new seats in New Jersey, Virginia, Iowa, and Mississippi. And if you understand political history, you know that 2017 was the year of the resistance wave that swept Democrats into power in response to Trump's first term, and we're seeing that same energy mobilize again, except this time voters have the benefit of experience. They've seen this movie before and they know how it ends. The student debt crisis provides the perfect lens through which to examine the Republican Party's fundamental hostility to economic mobility, because the student loan debt crisis affects 42.5 million Americans, and Americans owe a total of $1.797 trillion in federal and private student loan debt, combined with federal student loan debt alone totaling $1.661 trillion, which represents not just individual financial burden, but a systemic failure to recognize that mass higher education is the foundation of a modern knowledge economy. 43.6 million Americans held federal student loan debt, with an average balance of $38,000 per borrower, and in total the U.S. has a collective balance of over $1.7 trillion in student loans. And when you think about the human stories behind those numbers, the young teacher who can't afford to buy a house, the nurse drowning in debt while caring for COVID patients, the social worker choosing between loan payments and groceries, you realize this isn't about individual irresponsibility, it's about a system designed to extract wealth from the working class and transfer it upward. What's happening with the Department of Education represents something even more sinister than simple budget cuts, because the briefing was led by Lindsey Burke, now Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Programs at the department, who also co-authored the education section of Project 2025, outlining how to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education, which means this entire operation was planned and plotted by Heritage Foundation extremists, who see public education not as a social good, but as an impediment to their vision of a stratified society, where your economic station is determined by birth, not by merit. NAACP President Derek Johnson said the executive order calling for the Department of Education's dismantling is unconstitutional, and Trump is not just seeking to shut down an agency, he is deliberately dismantling the basic functions of our democracy, one piece at a time. And this is absolutely the correct framing, because education has always been the great equalizer, the mechanism by which a democracy prevents itself from calcifying into aristocracy, and Trump's assault on education is fundamentally an assault on democracy itself. The Republican talking points about taxpayers bearing the burden completely collapse under scrutiny, because let's examine who actually benefits from student loan relief versus who benefited from Trump's tax policies, because the SAVE program offered the most generous terms for low-income borrowers with monthly payments as low as 5% of discretionary income and promised debt cancellation after as little as 10 years of payments, which means this was specifically targeted at people who needed help, not hedge fund managers, but Trump's 2017 tax cuts permanently reduced the corporate rate from 35% to 21%, showering billions on the wealthiest corporations, while working families got temporary crumbs that have already expired. The move strips borrowers of the most affordable repayment plan that would help millions to stay on track with their loans while keeping a roof over their head. And when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're talking about an administration that's literally making it harder for people to afford basic shelter, so that they can pay back loans for education that society told them they needed to succeed, which is such a perfect encapsulation of late-stage capitalism's cruelty that you almost have to admire the dystopian efficiency of it. The approval rating collapse tells us everything about where this administration's priorities diverge from what actual human beings care about, because approval of Trump's handling of the economy and immigration are down about 10 points since March, and fewer adults have a positive view of how Trump is handling his job overall. The economy and immigration, Trump, who's become increasingly synonymous with his party, has slipped on issues that were major strengths, with approval of his handling of crime falling from 53%, and immigration declining from 49% approval in March to 38% now, demonstrating that the MAGA coalition is fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions, because you can't promise populism and deliver plutocracy forever without the mask slipping. And here's the kicker that should terrify Republicans looking toward the midterms, because Trump is viewed negatively when it comes to his handling of the economy, and a Politico poll found that many Americans, including almost 4 in 10 Trump voters, are saying the cost of living is the worst they can remember it being, that the president owns the economy, and that he's not doing enough to fix it, while Trump dismissed affordability as a con job invented by Democrats, which is political malpractice of the highest order, because when 40% of your own voters think you're failing on the issue that got you elected, you're not just losing the center, you're losing your base. What we're witnessing in real time is the collision between Republican ideology and material reality, because 7 in 10 in an ABC Ipsos poll said they're paying more for groceries. 3/4 in an Economist's YouGov poll said they have paid higher prices because of tariffs, including a majority of Republicans, with only 13% saying tariffs should be increased, which means Trump's signature economic policy is underwater even among his own supporters. And yet the Republican response is to make life harder for working families by eliminating student loan relief and gutting education funding. The cynicism is breathtaking, because they know these policies hurt people. They've seen the polling, they've watched their candidates underperform in special elections, but they're ideologically committed to a vision of governance that privileges capital over labor, profit over people, accumulated wealth over earned prosperity. When Jeffries says the American people know that Republican policies have been a complete and total disaster, he's speaking to something profound about the disconnect between what politicians say and what people experience in their daily lives, because Protect Borrowers estimates roughly 5 million people could default on their college loans this quarter because of the new rules, 5 times the pre-pandemic rate, potentially costing those Americans tax refunds through garnishment and wage seizures, which means we're about to see a wave of financial devastation that will ripple through the economy, affecting not just borrowers but their families, their communities, their ability to participate in consumer spending that drives economic growth. Trump's budget package phases out affordable loan repayment plans by July 2028 and caps new borrowing at $65,000 per child for undergraduate studies and $100,000 for graduate school. Farage effectively prices working-class families out of higher education entirely, while legacy admissions and wealthy families who can pay cash continue to dominate elite institutions, cementing intergenerational inequality. The ideological project here is transparent if you know how to read it. Because Republicans have never truly believed in public investment in human capital, they see education as a private good to be purchased on the market, and if you can't afford it, well, that's just the market working as intended, sorting the deserving from the undeserving. But what they refuse to acknowledge is that a typical worker with a bachelor's degree has earned about $1 million more by the end of her career than her counterpart, with only a high school diploma, which means society as a whole benefits massively from an educated populace through higher tax revenues, less crime, better health outcomes, civic participation, innovation, and every other metric that makes a society worth living in. The Republican position essentially argues that individuals should bear all the risk and all the cost of an investment that produces enormous positive externalities for everyone, which is economically illiterate, morally bankrupt, and politically untenable, which is why they're losing elections. Here's what makes the Trump administration's education policies particularly sinister from a historical perspective, because NAACP President Derek Johnson said this is a dark day for the millions of American children who depend on federal funding for a quality education, including those in poor and rural communities with parents who voted for Trump, meaning the people who will be hurt most by these policies are Trump's own voters in economically distressed regions who were promised that he would fight for them, but are instead getting austerity and abandonment. The Department of Education was created specifically to ensure that federal grid sources reach vulnerable populations, to enforce civil rights in education, to provide oversight and accountability for how tax dollars are spent on education and dismantling. It doesn't return power to the states. It returns us to an era where your zip code determines your educational destiny, where separate is unequal, where the children of privilege get opportunity and everyone else gets left behind. The student debt crisis is ultimately a crisis of values about what kind of society we want to be, because every developed nation has figured out that investing in education pays enormous dividends, but America has chosen a path of credentialism without accessibility, where we tell young people they need degrees to survive, then saddle them with decades of debt, then blame them for not pulling themselves up by bootstraps they can't afford to buy. Critics warned that the settlement would raise costs for borrowers, particularly those that may already be struggling with economic uncertainty, and Abby Shafroth of the National Consumer Law Center said ripping the Savvy plan away from student loan borrowers now without access to a clear and affordable alternative is reckless and short-sighted, creating even more needless confusion, uncertainty, and financial stress for millions of Americans already struggling with the rising cost of living, which captures the essential cruelty of Republican governance, where the suffering is not an unfortunate side effect, but the point, because they believe hardship builds character, that struggle sorts the worthy from the unworthy, that compassion is weakness. What Jeffries understands, and what every Democrat needs to hammer home between now and the midterms, is that this isn't just about policy, it's about whose side you're on, because Republicans will need to defend much more vulnerable seats if they have any hope of keeping their House majority, while Democrats are capitalizing on President Donald Trump's unpopularity and the public's persistent frustration with the economy. And the special election results show that when Democrats focus on kitchen table economics, on the material conditions of people's lives, on affordability and opportunity, they win even in deep red territory. Democratic candidate Aftian Ben focused the campaign on affordability, and her message resonated throughout the district, with the Democratic vote share increasing in every county, which provides the blueprint, because voters don't care about culture war nonsense when they're drowning in debt, when groceries cost too much, when their kids can't afford college, when the American dream feels like a cruel joke. The ending of the SAVE program represents a moral test for America, because we have to ask ourselves what we value more: the abstract principle that people should pay back every penny of debt they incurred, even if that debt was predicated on false promises about the value of education and the availability of good jobs, or the concrete reality that we need an educated populace to compete globally, to innovate, to solve the existential challenges of climate change and technological disruption. The Biden administration announced the SAVE program in 2023, calling it the most affordable student loan repayment plan ever, and the plan allowed 4.6 million of the program's more than 7 million enrollees to lower their monthly bills to $0 per month, meaning millions of people who were getting relief, who were able to save money, buy homes, start businesses, contribute to the economy, are now going to see their financial situations deteriorate, and when they deteriorate, they'll remember who did this to them. What we're witnessing is the logical endpoint of 4 decades of conservative governance that has treated education as a luxury rather than a necessity, that has defunded public institutions while subsidizing private wealth, that has told working people to compete in a global economy while denying them the tools to compete. And now, as that project reaches its crescendo, we see millions of Americans saying enough is enough. We see special elections swinging double digits. We see Trump's approval cratering. We see the contradictions becoming impossible to ignore. The choice before us could not be clearer, because on one side you have a Democratic Party that believes government should invest in people, that education is a public good, that debt relief for struggling borrowers is good policy and good politics, and on the other side you have Republicans who are literally dismantling the Department of Education, while 7 million borrowers lose their most affordable repayment option, while telling us this is somehow freedom. And so when Hakeem Jeffries stands there and says Trump has destroyed the Department of Education in real time, he's not engaging in hyperbole, he's describing observable reality, because the changes represent a major step forward for the administration's dismantling of the department, which has mainly involved cutting jobs since President Donald Trump called for its elimination, and 6 new agreements will effectively move billions of dollars in grant programs to other agencies, with the Department of Labor taking over some of the largest federal funding streams for K-12 schools, which is destruction by bureaucratic reassignment, death by 1,000 cuts, the systematic erasure of federal capacity to ensure educational equity. When he says they're going after hardworking American students who are just trying to experience the American dream, he's describing the lived reality. It's more than 7 million people enrolled in the SAVE plan, who will face upheaval as the department begins outreach about how to repay their loans under less favorable terms than they were promised. The American people are watching, and they're learning, and they're organizing, and they're voting, and the special elections prove it. The approval ratings prove it. The energy on the ground proves it. And come November 2026, Republicans are going to learn a painful lesson about what happens when you govern against the interests of the people who sent you to Washington, when you prioritize ideology over humanity, when you choose cruelty over compassion, when you dismantle opportunity in the name of fiscal discipline that somehow never applies to tax cuts for billionaires or military spending or corporate subsidies. This is the fight of our generation between a vision of America where everyone gets a fair shot, where education is a right, where we invest in human potential, versus a vision where only those born into wealth get opportunity, where education is a commodity, where debt is a mechanism of social control, where the American dream dies not with a bang, but with the quiet desperation of millions crushed under obligations they can never escape, because we as a society decided that helping people was somehow unfair to those who didn't need help. The choice is ours, and the consequences are enormous, and Hakeem Jeffries just told you exactly what's at stake. Now the question is, what are you going to do about it?